The evening air was unusually still for early autumn, a brittle quiet that seemed to cling to the sprawling estate of Ashborne Hall. Lady Rosamund, the mistress of the house, had been hosting a small gathering of her closest acquaintances, friends and family who thrived on polite conversation and the occasional private scandal. It was the sort of gathering where laughter, restrained and elegant, mingled with the faint aroma of freshly polished wood and the subtle scent of roses from the gardens outside. Yet, beneath the surface of civility, tensions simmered like coals waiting for a spark. Miss Marple arrived the following morning, called upon by a letter from a rather flustered but dignified Lady Rosamund. "There is a matter of utmost delicacy," the letter read, "and though the police have investigated, they are confounded. I hope, Miss Marple, that your insight may illuminate what has remained shadowed from us all." The tone was polite but urgent, and that very urgency stirred Miss Marple's curiosity. Upon arrival, she was greeted by a scene that, on the surface, suggested nothing more than a minor domestic disturbance. Lady Rosamund appeared composed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She led Miss Marple to the grand sitting-room, where a single, peculiar object lay on the polished mahogany table, a pearl of extraordinary size and lustre, its surface seemingly flawless. Yet there was something about it that made one pause, almost as if it carried a secret within its smooth, opalescent shell. "It was here, on this table, when I returned from my walk in the garden," Lady Rosamund explained, her voice calm yet edged with apprehension. "I found it lying atop my jewellery box, which was locked. I had not touched it since yesterday. I cannot fathom how it came to be here." Miss Marple examined the pearl carefully, noting its immaculate appearance and the subtle way it caught the morning light. There were no smudges, no fingerprints, nothing to suggest recent handling. And yet the question lingered. If no one had touched it, how had it arrived on the box? She turned her gaze to the locked drawer itself. There was no sign of tampering. The lock was intact, and the key remained in Lady Rosamund's possession. "It is unusual," Miss Marple said quietly, her mind already tracing threads of possibility. "A pearl should not appear by magic, yet it seems to have done so. May I ask if anyone else might have had access to the room?" Lady Rosamund shook her head. "No one. My maid Clara is devoted and punctual. My guests were occupied elsewhere, and the household staff are trustworthy beyond doubt. It is as though it has appeared by some enchantment." She smiled faintly, as if to lighten the eerie tension, but Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the shadow of doubt beneath the gesture. The detective spent the next hour wandering the corridors of Ashborne Hall, taking note of doors, windows, and the subtle signs of daily life. She examined the windows in the sitting-room. Each was secured from the inside. The fireplace bore no marks of recent use, and there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. Yet the pearl remained, a silent, inexplicable presence on the table. Miss Marple then called upon the maid, Clara, whose hands were smooth but experienced with the care of fine linens and delicate furnishings. Clara's account was meticulous, her recollection precise. She swore without hesitation that the box had been locked the previous evening, that she had dusted the room, and that no one had entered after she completed her tasks. Her sincerity was evident, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that truth can often hide in the shadows between statements. "What of your guests, Lady Rosamund?" she inquired. "Did anyone express curiosity about your jewellery, or speak of the pearl in particular?" "No," Lady Rosamund replied. "Though a pearl of this size is rare, none of my friends have mentioned it. We spoke of the weather, of the gardens, of recent travels. Nothing that could suggest this anomaly." Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, turning over the possibilities. A locked room, a missing key, a pearl that appeared without human interference. It all suggested something impossibly complex. Yet perhaps the solution lay in the simplest explanation, as so often it did. But as she examined the room a second time, her attention was drawn to the carpet beneath the table. A faint, almost imperceptible impression marred the weave, a footprint, small and delicate, but unmistakably present. "Have you noticed this before?" she asked Lady Rosamund, pointing to the subtle indentation. The lady bent closer, frowning. "I cannot say I have. But surely, Miss Marple, a footprint here. It must be a mistake. No one enters here without my knowledge." Miss Marple considered the footprint silently. Its small size suggested a woman, or perhaps a young girl, though there was a certain slipperiness to the pattern that made it hard to place. What could this mean? Someone had been here. Perhaps someone had left the pearl intentionally or unwittingly, but why leave such an enigmatic clue? Her attention then drifted to the mantelpiece, where a single photograph stood, a black-and-white image of Lady Rosamund as a young woman, smiling faintly at the camera, the pearl she had inherited from her mother resting on her wrist. Miss Marple felt the chill of recognition. The pearl was no ordinary trinket. It was a family heirloom, coveted not just for its beauty but for the prestige it conferred. The detective spent the rest of the afternoon speaking with the household staff, noting their alibis, their routines, and the subtle glances exchanged among them. Each account was consistent, yet each seemed to carry a hidden tension, as if someone, somewhere, knew more than they revealed. The mystery of the pearl deepened with every question, for no one admitted to touching it, yet its presence on the locked box was undeniable. As twilight fell, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, gazing out over the gardens, the fading light casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. She thought of the pearl, of the locked box, of the tiny footprint pressed into the carpet. It was a riddle that teased the mind, a puzzle that refused to be solved through ordinary means. And yet she felt the familiar thrill of a mind on the verge of discovery. When Lady Rosamund returned to inquire about progress, Miss Marple spoke with calm certainty. "This crime," she said softly, "though it seems baffling, is not without pattern. The pearl is a message as much as an object. Someone wishes for it to be found, and in doing so, they have revealed a detail, small, almost invisible, but crucial. The solution lies not in the impossibility of the act, but in the circumstances that allowed it to occur. A careful observer, Lady Rosamund, may find the truth hiding in plain sight." Lady Rosamund's eyes widened slightly, hope mingling with lingering worry. "You believe it can be resolved?" she asked. "I do," Miss Marple replied, her eyes glinting with the quiet certainty of experience. "The rest is merely a matter of patience, observation, and the willingness to see what others overlook. Sometimes the most perplexing crime is solved not by the extraordinary, but by the ordinary, revealed in a way that only the keenest eyes may notice." As the evening deepened and the house grew quieter, the pearl sat untouched on its perch, as if waiting for the unravelling of its secret. And in that stillness, Miss Marple sensed the threads of a story yet to be completed, a story that would demand careful listening, acute perception, and the subtle weaving together of details that seemed, at first, random or misleading. In that locked room, with its polished surfaces and shadowed corners, the unsolvable crime of the cursed pearl had already begun to yield its first hints, and Miss Marple knew that with time the truth would emerge from the silence. The next morning Miss Marple rose early, before the household stirred, and made her way quietly to the sitting-room. The pearl gleamed softly in the pale light of dawn, resting innocently on its pedestal, yet radiating an unspoken tension that seemed to permeate the air. While the servants busied themselves with breakfast and preparations for the day, Miss Marple allowed her mind to wander over the events of the previous evening. The locked box, the pearl's mysterious arrival, and the tiny footprint pressed into the carpet, all were fragments of a larger puzzle, each seemingly minor, but undoubtedly crucial. She began her inspection with the furniture itself. The table upon which the pearl rested bore no scratches or indentations beyond those from its own legs. The jewellery box, an elegant ebony piece inlaid with mother-of-pearl, remained securely locked. Yet Miss Marple noticed something subtle, a faint smudge along the edge of the box where one would not normally place a hand. It was as if someone had brushed against it ever so lightly, deliberately avoiding the main surface. It was a detail so trivial that any official investigator, preoccupied with the obvious, would have overlooked it. By the time Inspector Harrington arrived, the household had gathered in the drawing-room. Harrington, a competent man but one with a penchant for procedure over perception, had already questioned the staff thoroughly. He took meticulous notes, inspected the pearl with a polite formality, and nodded at the locked box. "No sign of forced entry, Miss Marple," he remarked. "No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. It's as though the pearl materialized out of thin air." Miss Marple listened with polite attention, but her mind noted the subtle cues Harrington missed. She observed the inspector's eyes linger for a moment too long on Lady Rosamund, then flick toward the maid, Clara. There was a tension in Harrington's manner that suggested he suspected one or both, yet he had no concrete evidence. Miss Marple, on the other hand, was content to allow suspicion to simmer in her mind, letting the details surface naturally. She turned her attention to the rest of the room, scanning the surroundings as if the very walls might speak. A vase of freshly cut roses stood near the window, its petals still pristine, yet a single leaf had fallen and rested sideways upon the carpet. It seemed insignificant, yet Miss Marple noted its placement, directly in line with the footprint's indentation. Something about it suggested that it had been disturbed recently, perhaps brushed aside by a hurried hand. Clara, the maid, had been hovering near the doorway, her hands wringing slightly, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple's instincts, honed over decades of quiet observation, picked up the imperceptible twitch in her lips, the subtle hesitation when she answered the inspector's questions. "Did you move anything in this room yesterday, Clara?" Miss Marple asked softly. Clara's eyes widened and she shook her head. "No, Miss Marple," she said. "I dusted as usual. She hesitated, a faint quiver betraying her composure. "I didn't touch the box. I promise." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, making no comment. It was enough to register that Clara was hiding something, though what remained unclear. She knew that the truth often revealed itself in the smallest inconsistencies, hesitations, glances, gestures that, to the untrained eye, might seem inconsequential. While the inspector examined the pearl under magnification, Miss Marple noticed another detail. A thread, thin and almost invisible, caught at the edge of the table. It was dark, slightly frayed, and seemed completely out of place in the otherwise immaculate room. Picking it up carefully with her gloved fingers, she turned it over and over, noting the texture and weave. "Curious," she murmured. Harrington, preoccupied with official forms and measurements, barely glanced at her find. "Curious, Miss Marple?" he asked. "It's just a thread, surely. Perhaps from the carpet or one of the curtains?" "Perhaps," she replied with a gentle smile. "Or perhaps it is the remnant of someone's hurried movement, a detail that escaped the larger view." She turned to Lady Rosamund, who stood nearby, frowning. "Would you mind if I examined the drawers in your writing desk? I should like to understand the room's usual order. Sometimes disturbances reveal themselves in the smallest deviations from habit." Lady Rosamund consented, watching silently as Miss Marple opened drawers and rifled through them with care. Nothing seemed amiss until Miss Marple paused at the bottom drawer. A slip of paper protruded, slightly crumpled, its edge barely visible. Pulling it free, she unfolded it with deliberate slowness. It was a note written in an unfamiliar hand, yet the content was unsettling in its simplicity. "The pearl knows what cannot be spoken." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. This note was not just a message, it was a clue, perhaps deliberately left to mislead or frighten. Its vagueness was its power, yet the act of leaving it revealed audacity and intent. Harrington read it over her shoulder, brow furrowed. "Riddles won't solve this crime, Miss Marple. We need tangible evidence." "And tangible evidence," she said softly, "often hides in the intangible, the hesitation of a witness, the misplacement of an object, the imprint of a footstep." She gestured toward the tiny indentation in the carpet, the stray thread, and the slightly displaced rose leaf. 3 minor details, but together they suggest that someone has moved through this room deliberately, yet with caution. Someone who wishes to be noticed, yet not caught. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple methodically examined each member of the household. She observed reactions, noted inconsistencies, and catalogued even the subtlest changes in expression. The cook, Mr. Aldridge, who seemed otherwise inconspicuous, flinched ever so slightly when the pearl was mentioned. The gardener, old Mr. Harrow, who spent most of his time outside, seemed nervous when asked if he had been near the sitting-room windows, and Clara, the maid, avoided eye contact entirely, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. Miss Marple allowed each of them to speak, not interrupting, but listening with an ear tuned to the slightest inflection or hesitation. It was during this quiet observation that she noticed the first hint of deception. Clara, when asked about the garden doors, hesitated for a heartbeat too long before replying. It was an imperceptible pause, yet to Miss Marple it rang as clear as a bell. Someone was lying, not out of malice perhaps, but out of fear or uncertainty. Later she examined the sitting room once more, walking slowly along the carpet, noting the placement of furniture and objects as if seeing them for the first time. The pearl seemed to shift subtly in her mind's eye, not as a mere object, but as a catalyst, a signal that drew the truth to itself. She imagined the route someone might have taken to place it, the precise movements required to avoid detection, the care necessary to leave no evidence beyond the faintest footprint and a single thread. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had pieced together the first threads of a pattern, though the tapestry remained incomplete. The pearl, the footprint, the misplaced thread, the note, and Clara's hesitant response were not random. They were deliberate. Someone had staged the appearance of the pearl, leaving behind carefully calculated hints that both obscured and revealed their actions. The question was not if the mystery could be solved, but when, and by whom. As she sipped her tea in quiet contemplation, Miss Marple allowed her mind to wander along the possibilities. Each suspect, each clue, each subtle reaction had its place in a chain of events that only she could unravel. It was not yet time to reveal her conclusions, for the full picture had not yet emerged, but she felt the familiar thrill of approach, the moment when the unseen pattern begins to make itself known, when deception starts to unravel under the patient gaze of an astute observer. The house grew quieter as the sun dipped toward the horizon, and the pearl caught the dying light, shimmering with a quiet, unnatural brilliance. Miss Marple's eyes rested upon it, sharp and attentive. Somewhere, hidden in the subtleties of human behaviour and the minutiae of a room's order, lay the answer. And she would find it, for the pearl was not merely a treasure, nor a curiosity. It was a message, a puzzle, and a confession waiting to be read by the keenest of eyes. Miss Marple began the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. Ashborne Hall in the early light seemed almost serene, the sprawling gardens bathed in a gentle mist, yet within the house the air was taut with unspoken tension. The pearl still rested on the mahogany table, catching every stray beam of sunlight, as though mocking the household with its unyielding mystery. Miss Marple's first task was to speak with each member of the household, to listen carefully and note discrepancies that might otherwise escape notice. She started with Clara, the maid, whose nervousness the previous day had been unmistakable. Clara had been punctual, yet her manner was jittery, and she avoided eye contact as she served tea. "Clara," Miss Marple began gently, "please tell me exactly what you did yesterday from the moment you arrived until nightfall." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the cups. I dusted the sitting room first, then polished the silver in the dining room," Clara said. Her voice wavered, and she paused, glancing briefly at the pearl. I didn't touch the box, I promise. I went outside to water the plants before dinner, and I don't remember anyone entering the sitting room after me." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Clara. "And the garden doors? Were they all secured when you went outside?" Clara hesitated, biting her lip. I think so, but Mr. Harrow was in the garden near the west wing. I might have forgotten. I didn't check every door." The maid's uncertainty was subtle but significant, a lapse so minor it could easily be dismissed, yet in Miss Marple's experience such small contradictions often indicated more than mere forgetfulness. She made a note of it. Next, she called upon Mr. Harrow, the elderly gardener. His hands were rough and weathered, his eyes bright but slightly shifty. "Mr. Harrow, were you near the sitting room yesterday afternoon?" Miss Marple asked. "I was trimming the hedges, Miss Marple," he said, a little too quickly. "Didn't enter the house at all. Doors were locked when I went inside to fetch some tools, but I wouldn't touch anything. Not without permission, mind you." "Did anyone else enter the garden while you were working?" she pressed. Harrow's eyes flickered. "Well, I might have seen Clara come and go, but that's all. I didn't notice anything unusual." His tone was defensive, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple made a mental note of it. There was something he was withholding, though whether through fear, loyalty, or guilt remained unclear. The cook, Mr. Aldridge, was next. He was a man of impeccable manners and a firm sense of order, yet he seemed oddly eager to offer information. "Miss Marple, I assure you I saw nothing unusual. The staff behaved as usual. The house is a disciplined place. Perhaps the pearl— well, it might have been moved by accident, perhaps by Lady Rosamund herself." Miss Marple noted his eagerness, which in itself was a red flag. Those who volunteer information too readily often do so to control the narrative or to misdirect. "You did not see anyone near the sitting-room yesterday afternoon?" she asked. "Not that I can recall," Aldridge replied, though his gaze dropped for the briefest instant, almost imperceptibly. The hesitation was slight, yet Miss Marple registered it immediately. Lady Rosamund herself was calm, but her composure had a fragile quality. When asked to recount the events of the previous day, she spoke with deliberate precision, yet occasionally contradicted herself in ways that seemed natural to the untrained ear, but not to a practised observer. "I walked in the gardens after luncheon," she said. "I returned about 4 o'clock, went straight to the sitting-room to check my correspondence. Or was it 5? Yes, 5 o'clock. I don't recall seeing anyone enter before that." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed subtly. "You did not pass the sitting-room doors at any point during the afternoon. Walk?" "No," Lady Rosamund replied firmly, though she hesitated for a heartbeat, a small flicker of uncertainty passing across her face. It was fleeting, but Miss Marple noticed it. After speaking with the household, Miss Marple considered the statements together. Each was plausible on its own, yet when taken collectively, contradictions emerged. Clara's uncertainty about the garden doors, Harrow's defensive stance, Aldridge's eagerness, and Lady Rosamund's fleeting hesitation all hinted at a story more complex than a simple accidental displacement of a pearl. As the day wore on, Miss Marple moved through the rooms, revisiting the sitting-room and tracing her steps from the previous day. She noted the faint footprint in the carpet again, along with the stray thread and the slightly displaced rose leaf. These physical clues, combined with the inconsistencies in statements, suggested that someone had been deliberately concealing their actions. Late in the afternoon, she summoned Clara once more. "Tell me, child," she said softly, "is there anyone you trust enough to tell the truth about the pearl without fear of reprisal?" Clara hesitated, glancing at the pearl, then down at her hands. I think I know," she whispered, "but I cannot speak freely. It involves someone important in the household, someone I dare not offend." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Sometimes the truth is safest when shared quietly. You may speak to me openly." With that, Clara finally confessed a fragment of the story. She had seen Mr. Harrow near the sitting-room during her duties, but she had assumed it was inconsequential. Harrow had been moving about carefully, almost furtively, and she had noticed him glance toward the jewellery box. But when asked, she had concealed her observation out of fear of reprisal or scandal. Miss Marple considered this revelation carefully. It did not yet explain the entire mystery of the pearl, but it confirmed that movement had occurred in the room contrary to prior statements. Harrow's earlier evasiveness, coupled with Clara's admission, indicated hidden motives, perhaps loyalty, perhaps fear, perhaps an entirely different agenda. Turning her attention back to Mr. Harrow, Miss Marple posed a few pointed questions. "Mr. Harrow, did you enter the sitting-room yesterday? Were you aware of the pearl's placement?" The gardener's hands trembled slightly and he swallowed. I only passed by," he admitted. "I did not touch the pearl, I swear, but I heard voices. A conversation that seemed secretive. I thought it best not to interfere." "Voices?" Miss Marple prompted. "Yes. Lady Rosamund spoke to someone. A visitor, I believe. I do not know who. The voices were low, but I could hear mention of the pearl." His eyes darted nervously. Miss Marple's mind began to weave the pieces together. The careful avoidance, the hidden conversation, the discrepancies in statements, they all pointed to a deliberate orchestration. The pearl was not simply misplaced or accidentally revealed. It was central to a plan, a signal, or a message, and the motives behind it were concealed beneath polite facades and feigned ignorance. By evening, the detective had reconstructed the likely timeline. Someone had entered the sitting-room, either to place or move the pearl, while carefully ensuring that no one observed. Clara had glimpsed this. Harrow had noticed the movements, and the staff had either deliberately or unwittingly concealed the truth in their eagerness to maintain propriety. Each account contained a kernel of truth, yet each was filtered through fear, loyalty, or self-interest. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, reflecting on the day's revelations. The pearl gleamed faintly on the table, a silent provocateur, and the household moved around it, unaware of the scrutiny under which they now stood. Voices of deception had been spoken, each one a thread in a growing tapestry of intrigue. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the faint footprint, the thread, and the displaced rose-leaf once more. With patience and attention to subtlety, she sensed that the hidden motives would soon surface fully, and the careful orchestration behind the pearl's appearance would be laid bare. The next morning, Ashborne Hall felt heavier, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of secrets whispered behind closed doors. Miss Marple rose early, moving quietly through the corridors before the household fully stirred, her mind alive with threads of the previous day's interviews. The statements she had gathered were a tangled web of truth and half-truths, each individual coloured by fear, loyalty, or self-interest. Today she would begin unravelling the motivations that had brought them to conceal the pearl's mystery, and perhaps in so doing bring clarity to a growing darkness. Miss Marple began with Lady Rosamund herself. She was gracious, yet there was a subtle tension in her eyes, a lingering shadow that spoke of private concern. "Lady Rosamund," Miss Marple began, "if I may, let us speak candidly. Who, in your estimation, might wish to take the pearl from you, or unsettle you by its sudden appearance?" The lady considered the question carefully, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "The pearl is valuable, certainly, but it is also a family heirloom. Greed is always a temptation, Miss Marple. My cousin, Lady Beatrice, has long envied my inheritance. She believes she should have received it, and there are others too, distant acquaintances who might see the pearl as an opportunity. Yet it is unthinkable that anyone would act with such audacity within my own home." Miss Marple nodded, her mind quietly cataloguing Lady Rosamund's words. Greed indeed could motivate a bold move, but there was something in the lady's tone, an undercurrent of fear, that hinted at more than simple avarice. Turning to Clara, the maid, Miss Marple gently inquired about her own fears. Clara's face paled slightly. I did not mean to deceive," she confessed, "but there is the matter of the gardener, Mr. Harrow. He can be strict. He values his routines above all. I feared speaking freely might cause him to suspect I had interfered, though I touched nothing. I only saw." Miss Marple's eyes studied her carefully. Fear, loyalty, and perhaps a desire to protect others were layered in Clara's confession. It was an understandable human impulse, yet it revealed the delicate threads of influence that ran through the household. Each person's behaviour was shaped not merely by personal gain, but by the unseen pressures of expectation, hierarchy, and reputation. Mr. Harrow, summoned once more, revealed further complexity. "I did not touch the pearl, Miss Marple," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But I overheard words that suggested someone sought to test Lady Rosamund. Perhaps it was a warning, perhaps something else. I do not know who, only that. The intent was deliberate." Miss Marple considered this. The gardener's motives were not clear-cut. He claimed awareness without interference, suggesting a man torn between curiosity, prudence, and the desire to maintain his position within the household. His silence had allowed the orchestrator of the pearl's movement to proceed unchallenged, yet he bore a fragment of knowledge that could prove essential. The cook, Mr. Aldridge, offered another piece of the puzzle. "I assure you, Miss Marple, no one in the household would dare act against Lady Rosamund openly," he said, his eagerness masking a shadow of anxiety. "But, I confess, there is history here. Old rivalries, grudges buried under polite conversation. The pearl may have stirred them. Lady Beatrice's jealousy is well known, and even within the staff small resentments simmer. Minor slights, if misinterpreted, can provoke unexpected behaviour." Miss Marple made a careful note. Jealousy, long simmering under the surface, could explain subtle acts of defiance or concealment. Yet, it did not account fully for the precision and audacity involved in the pearl's appearance on the locked box. Clearly, someone with awareness of the household's routines had orchestrated this with intent, selecting the moment to maximize both confusion and secrecy. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple began mapping the complex interrelations among the household. Lady Rosamund and Lady Beatrice, cousins bound by both affection and rivalry, had been at odds since childhood, each subtle insult remembered and catalogued. The staff, while outwardly loyal, held minor resentments and attachments, creating a web of motivations that intersected with one another in unpredictable ways. It was Clara's hesitancy that intrigued Miss Marple the most. Fear had governed her actions, yes, but it suggested an awareness of pressures beyond mere loyalty. Perhaps she had glimpsed something or overheard a conversation that left her unsure of where her duty lay. Miss Marple reflected on the small thread caught on the table and the displaced rose leaf. Each was a trace of movement, a subtle imprint of someone's deliberate passage. Who among them had both opportunity and a motive intricate enough to orchestrate such a scenario? Then there was the matter of the note discovered in the bottom drawer. The pearl knows what cannot be spoken. Its author had intended ambiguity, yet the phrasing hinted at deeper knowledge, a concealed truth, perhaps a secret long held within Ashborne Hall's walls. Miss Marple considered that the pearl itself might have symbolic significance, a family heirloom entwined with pride, inheritance, and perhaps even past misdeeds. In such a context, fear, jealousy, and desire could converge to create an intricate dance of deception. Miss Marple revisited Lady Beatrice in the late morning, who had arrived unexpectedly at the estate under the pretence of paying a social visit. Her interest in the pearl was immediate and keen, yet her composure was almost theatrical, a mask of concern hiding sharper intentions. "Dear Rosamund," she said, her tone honeyed, "I hear you have an unusual pearl now. Such a curiosity. One hopes it has not caused alarm. Surely it is merely an amusing puzzle." Miss Marple watched her closely. The eagerness, the excessive politeness, the subtle attempt to redirect attention from the pearl's precise circumstances, all of it was a sign, subtle but unmistakable, that Lady Beatrice's curiosity might be motivated by more than mere social interest. She had both opportunity and motive. Opportunity in knowing the household's routines intimately, and motive in her long-standing envy of her cousin's inheritance and position. Yet Miss Marple did not jump to conclusions. The web of motives was intricate. Clara had her fear, Harrow his cautious knowledge, Aldridge his sense of propriety, Lady Beatrice her envy, and Lady Rosamund herself harboured secrets tied to pride and familial expectation. Each thread contributed to the complexity of the scenario, and no single theory accounted for every detail. The fingerprintless pearl, the locked box, the tiny footprint, the thread on the table, the ambiguous note, all required a mind capable of threading together human behaviour with keen observation. As afternoon descended, Miss Marple revisited the sitting-room, tracing the movements she imagined the orchestrator of events must have taken. A pattern emerged. The pearl had been deliberately placed to ensure it would be found, the message left to provoke speculation, and the minimal physical traces designed to create just enough doubt to ensnare the household in its own uncertainty. It was a test as much as a crime, a challenge to the perceptions and loyalties of everyone present. She reflected upon each person's statements, weighing inconsistencies against opportunity, motive, and character. Clara's fear suggested she had witnessed more than she admitted. Harrow's evasiveness hinted at knowledge withheld. Aldridge's eagerness to volunteer information seemed designed to misdirect, while Lady Beatrice's polite curiosity concealed a sharper intent. Lady Rosamund, despite her apparent innocence, carried the burden of family pride and the subtle, sometimes unconscious influence of history upon her household. By early evening, Miss Marple had constructed a tentative framework, a maze of interlocking motives, each influencing actions in ways that obscured the truth. Greed, jealousy, fear, and loyalty intertwined, producing the confusion that had left the pearl seemingly appearing by magic. No single act explained the entire scenario. It was the interaction of motives and opportunity that had created the appearance of impossibility. Sitting quietly near the window, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. The maze of motives was vast, yet not impenetrable. Each hidden intention, each carefully guarded secret, had left subtle traces for the observant mind. The task ahead was to follow those traces, to untangle the web of human behaviour until the orchestrator's actions were laid bare. And she felt certain that, with patience and careful attention, the truth would emerge from the complexity, revealing not merely the mystery of the pearl, but the deeper patterns of ambition, fear, and desire that had brought it into the light. The following morning brought a tense energy to Ashborne Hall. Word had spread quickly that the pearl's mystery might finally be resolved. Inspector Harrington, ever eager for closure, seemed determined to announce a solution before Miss Marple had fully examined the tangled web she had begun to untangle. He convened the household in the drawing-room, his expression a mix of satisfaction and impatience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have discovered what appears to be a critical piece of evidence. I am confident this resolves the matter of the pearl." All eyes turned to him expectantly, including Miss Marple's, her sharp gaze quietly assessing the display. Harrington held up a small envelope, slightly crumpled but clearly recent. "This note," he declared, "was found in the laundry room near the line where the staff hang linens. It reads, 'I took the pearl to show it to someone who deserves it more.' It is in a handwriting that, according to my analysis, matches one of the household staff." He looked toward Clara, whose hands were folded tightly in her lap. Clara's eyes widened, her lips trembling. I don't know anything about that note," she stammered. "I swear I never wrote it." Inspector Harrington, however, was already proceeding. "Given the handwriting match and the proximity to your daily chores, Miss Clara, the case appears straightforward. The pearl was taken, the note left and recovered. No, further investigation is required. We may consider the matter closed." The household exhaled collectively, relief mingling with mild embarrassment. Lady Rosamund, though maintaining her composure, looked wary, as if unconvinced by the inspector's swift judgment. Miss Marple, however, remained silent, her mind quietly sifting through inconsistencies. Something about this resolution felt premature. She examined the note carefully, noting the penmanship, the subtle pressure applied to the paper, and the phrasing. While it was true that the writing resembled Clara's, Miss Marple observed differences that suggested deliberate mimicry. The loops were exaggerated, the slant slightly off, as though an inexperienced forger had attempted to imitate a style remembered from casual observation. It was not proof of Clara's guilt, but a cunning attempt to direct suspicion toward her. Turning her attention to Clara, Miss Marple spoke gently. "Child, do not worry. It is not uncommon for a clever mind to attempt misdirection, especially when they wish to create a false sense of certainty." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't take the pearl, Miss Marple. I only saw Mr. Harrow near the sitting-room, and I was afraid to say anything. But I would never, never touch Lady Rosamund's treasure." Miss Marple nodded, the truth of the girl's sincerity shining through the fear and tension. It was clear that Clara's account aligned with earlier observations, fear, loyalty, and the small fragment of knowledge she had witnessed. The note, carefully planted, was intended to produce exactly the result it had, an apparently decisive clue that would shift attention onto the innocent. Inspector Harrington, however, was undeterred. "The handwriting evidence is conclusive," he insisted. "We have the note, the recovered pearl, and an explanation that matches the timeline. What more could one ask for?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, concealing the quiet thrill of knowing that the puzzle had only deepened. "Inspector," she said, "while the note appears compelling, it is precisely the simplicity of its apparent clarity that is suspicious. The pearl did not simply vanish and reappear. It was moved deliberately, in a manner designed to manipulate attention. Someone remains in the shadows observing, perhaps even guiding us toward a false conclusion." Harrington's brow furrowed, but he seemed unwilling to entertain the possibility. "Miss Marple, we cannot allow doubt to paralyze action. The pearl is returned, the note recovered. Surely that settles matters." Miss Marple allowed him to continue, quietly considering the next steps. She returned to the sitting-room, tracing the faint footprint in the carpet, examining the small thread on the table and noting the rose leaf that had been slightly displaced. These minor details had been overlooked in the rush to declare the case solved, yet they spoke louder than any note or handwriting. Analysis the true orchestrator had left them deliberately, knowing they would not be immediately recognized. Her mind returned to Harrow. He had been evasive, yet his proximity to the sitting room during the critical period was undeniable. He had claimed only to have overheard voices, but that in itself was curious. Who would speak in hushed tones about the pearl, and why? The false note might have been intended to deflect suspicion, but from whom, and toward what ultimate goal? By late morning, Miss Marple called Clara aside. "Child, let us consider the handwriting note carefully. It was designed to produce certainty where none should exist. Think back. Did you notice anyone handling paper yesterday? Anyone lingering near your duties or the laundry room in a manner that seemed unusual?" Clara's eyes brightened with recognition. "Yes, I did see Mr. Aldridge, the cook. He went into the laundry when I wasn't expecting him. I thought he was collecting linens, but it seemed odd. I didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple's mind pieced together the scenario. Aldridge, eager to misdirect, could have planted the note to create a false sense of closure, drawing attention away from the person who had orchestrated the pearl's movements within the sitting room itself. The plan was clever. Allow suspicion to fall upon a nervous maid, then recover the pearl with the note to produce an apparently airtight resolution. Yet, even in this apparent resolution, subtle inconsistencies remained. The footprint, the thread, the carefully displaced leaf, all had not been accounted for. Lady Rosamund, overhearing the conversation, looked troubled. "But if the case is already solved, Miss Marple, what more is there to uncover?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The solution as presented is neat and tidy, Lady Rosamund, but the pearl did not merely vanish and reappear. It was moved with intent, leaving behind traces that speak louder than any note. The true orchestrator remains unobserved, waiting for the moment when the household is distracted, confident that the matter has been resolved." As the day progressed, Miss Marple observed the household with renewed vigilance. She watched Harrow, noting the subtle shifts in his posture and the glances exchanged between him and Aldridge. She observed Clara, whose tension had eased slightly yet remained, and Lady Beatrice, whose curiosity had intensified at the idea of a resolved mystery. Each movement, each glance, each hesitation was a thread, weaving a larger tapestry that the authorities had missed in their rush for a solution. By late afternoon, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet reflection. The false victory was evident. A note, planted cleverly, had provided the authorities with an easy conclusion, one that satisfied their desire for certainty and their need for closure. Yet for the observant mind, it was a clear signal that the true culprit had not yet revealed themselves. Someone had manipulated events with precision, allowing the household to believe the matter resolved while they remained in the shadows. The pearl, resting once more upon the mahogany table, seemed almost to pulse with silent intent, a talisman of unspoken intrigue. Miss Marple sensed that the final act had not yet been played, and that the resolution everyone believed complete was merely a prelude. The orchestrator waited, concealed by the confidence that others would not suspect, biding time for the right moment to act again, or to be revealed in the unravelling of their own carefully constructed illusion. As night fell, the estate grew quiet once more. The false victory, so celebrated earlier in the day, hung in the air like a fragile veil, concealing truths that had yet to surface. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, reflecting on the evidence, the contradictions, and the human motives she had begun to untangle. One thing was certain: the case was far from solved, and the real criminal, shrewd and patient, lingered in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, or to be discovered. Miss Marple awoke the following morning with a quiet sense of anticipation. The false victory of the previous day lingered like a fog over Ashborne Hall, and though the household busied itself with daily routines, she sensed the truth was waiting to be uncovered, hidden beneath layers of history and human behaviour. Today, she resolved, she would examine not just the present circumstances, but the shadows of the past that whispered through the corridors of the estate. Her first stop was the library, a room dense with the scent of old books and the quiet weight of memory. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the spines, noting the titles and the small personal notations that Lady Rosamund had made in margins over decades. It was a room filled with knowledge, both recorded and secreted in the subtle choices of its owner. As she leafed through a volume on the history of Ashborne Hall, a folded slip of paper fell from between the pages. Unfolding it carefully, she discovered a brief note dated 25 years prior, in a handwriting that was both elegant and precise. "Beware the pearl's allure. Those who envy may strike when least expected." Miss Marple's mind flickered with recognition. The pearl, a family heirloom, had evidently been considered a source of temptation for generations. She recalled Lady Rosamund's own remark about Lady Beatrice's envy and the simmering tensions among the household staff. The note was not merely a curiosity, it was a warning, and it suggested that the dynamics of jealousy and desire surrounding the pearl were far older than anyone had considered. As she pondered this, Miss Marple remembered a minor detail from the previous day, a brief conversation between Lady Beatrice and Harrow, whispered in passing as though by accident. At the time it had seemed inconsequential, a mere exchange between cousin and gardener. Now, however, with the knowledge of the old note, she suspected a deeper connection. Perhaps Lady Beatrice had shared information about the pearl with Harrow long ago, or perhaps Harrow himself had a historical reason to feel involved or protective. Turning her attention to Mr. Aldridge, the cook, Miss Marple recalled his over-eagerness to volunteer information. Why would a man so seemingly devoted to propriety act with such ambition in guiding the investigation? It struck her that Aldridge had served Ashborne Hall for decades, witnessing generations of the family and their entanglements. Could he have been influenced by past grievances or loyalties, shaping his behaviour in subtle ways to protect or manipulate outcomes? Seeking clarity, Miss Marple requested access to old household records. In a dusty ledger, she found references to past staff and prior incidents involving valuable possessions, disputes over inheritances, and minor thefts that had never escalated to formal accusations. One entry in particular caught her eye. A theft of jewellery decades earlier, during Lady Rosamund's mother's tenure, had been quietly resolved when a maid, one of Harrow's predecessors, was moved to another estate, her involvement never publicly acknowledged. The patterns were subtle but unmistakable. Envy, secrecy, and concealment had long been a part of Ashborne Hall's rhythm, and the pearl, with its allure and history, had always been at the centre. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Harrow once more. The gardener had seemed evasive, yet observant, during her initial inquiries. Could he be motivated by a sense of duty rooted in the past, perhaps an inherited knowledge or loyalty that went beyond the immediate situation? And what of Lady Beatrice? Her envy had been remarked upon for decades, yet perhaps her ambitions were also informed by older grievances, family slights, inheritance disputes, or private knowledge of past incidents that had shaped her perspective. With this renewed focus, Miss Marple sought out Clara once again. The maid's nervousness had subsided slightly, yet Miss Marple sensed that the girl's memories might reveal the overlooked connections that were now forming in her mind. "Clara," she said gently, "you observed the movements in the sitting-room. Did you notice anyone behaving in a way that seemed familiar, or perhaps reminiscent of past incidents you've heard of from the household?" Clara hesitated, thinking carefully. I remember being told stories by the older staff about past mischief and about how the pearl was always a source of tension. Mr. Harrow's father worked here, I think, or his uncle. He used to warn people to be careful around the jewel, said it caused trouble if treated lightly. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. This was the connection she had been seeking. The household carried a history, embedded not just in the living members but in the very routines and knowledge passed down through generations. Harrow's careful, measured behaviour could be explained by these lessons. His attentiveness to subtle signs, a product of inherited responsibility or fear of repeating past mistakes. The detective's attention turned once more to Lady Beatrice. A quiet conversation revealed that she had indeed known of past incidents, though her intentions were veiled. "It is true," she admitted under Miss Marple's gentle questioning, "that I have long been aware of the pearl's influence, of how it can tempt and unsettle. I did not wish harm, only to understand its power and perhaps to ensure it remained in prudent hands. Her eyes flicked toward Harrow subtly, as if acknowledging an unspoken agreement between them. Miss Marple began to piece together the pattern. The crime, she realized, was not merely a matter of present greed or envy. It was the culmination of decades of influence, of lessons taught and secrets preserved within the household. Harrow, Aldridge, Clara, and even Lady Beatrice were all bound by a history they may not have fully articulated. Loyalty tempered by caution, ambition restrained by memory, fear shaped by prior transgressions. Each movement, each hesitation, each false lead was part of a rhythm learned over years, echoing the lessons embedded in the estate's long past. Revisiting the sitting room once more, Miss Marple noticed subtle signs she had overlooked. The tiny footprint in the carpet, the thread along table's edge, the slightly displaced rose leaf. These details, seemingly trivial, were in fact echoes of repeated behaviour, habits honed over decades by those who had been taught caution and discretion. Someone had acted deliberately, yet with a mind trained to minimise detection, a skill passed down from prior generations. By evening, Miss Marple gathered the household again. "The pearl," she began, her tone calm yet precise, "is more than an object of value. It is a catalyst, a focus of human desires, fears and loyalties that stretch back decades. The events of yesterday, the note, the footprints, and the subtle movements, all are part of a pattern informed by history. Someone moved carefully, aware of both the present household dynamics and the legacy of caution and secrecy surrounding this jewel." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "We are not dealing with a simple act of theft or mischief. The crime, if one can call it that, is rooted in the past. The orchestrator understood not only the physical layout of this house, but also the psychological patterns that have governed it for generations. To uncover the truth, we must consider not just opportunity and motive in the present, but the echoes of history that shaped every decision and every misstep." Lady Rosamund's eyes were wide with realization, and even Lady Beatrice seemed unsettled. Clara, seated quietly, looked relieved yet thoughtful, as if understanding that her own fear and hesitancy were part of a larger story she had barely begun to comprehend. Harrow remained quiet, his posture rigid but not defensive, as though acknowledging the weight of legacy pressing upon his actions. Miss Marple rose, her mind quietly racing through the connections she had now made. The overlooked details, the old incidents, the generational knowledge, they were all threads in the tapestry of the current mystery. The pearl had surfaced not simply as an object of desire, but as a mirror reflecting the past, exposing the intricate patterns that linked every household member to one another in subtle and often hidden ways. She allowed herself a small smile. The shadows of the past were no longer hidden. They were revealing the structure upon which the current mystery had been constructed. Understanding this would be key to uncovering the true orchestrator of events, and to resolving a puzzle that, though appearing to belong to the present, had roots that reached deep into the history of Ashborne Hall. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room as evening shadows lengthened across Ashborne Hall. The revelations from the previous day had shifted the investigation from the present to the long arc of history, revealing connections and motivations buried deep in time. Yet even with these insights, the orchestrator of the Pearl's movements remained elusive. Miss Marple knew she would need more than observation and careful questioning. She would need an unconventional approach, a way to prompt a reaction that might expose the subtle cracks in someone's carefully constructed deception. She rose and moved to the mahogany table, where the Pearl rested under a small silk cloth. The household had gathered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and lingering tension. Miss Marple addressed them gently. "Tonight, I wish to conduct an exercise, a small experiment, if you will. It is not a test of guilt, but a test of attention, memory, and perhaps honesty." Lady Rosamund inclined her head politely, though a flicker of unease passed across her face. Harrow and Aldridge exchanged glances, and Clara, quietly seated near the window, clutched her hands together as though bracing herself. Lady Beatrice, as usual, seemed composed, though her eyes betrayed keen interest. Miss Marple began by recounting the events of the previous day, deliberately omitting certain critical details, the note, the timing of movements, the minor disturbances in the sitting room. She spoke of the pearl, the placement on the table, the reactions of the household, and the seemingly resolved mystery, all while observing the listeners closely. "I would like each of you," she continued, "to tell me, in as much detail as you can recall, what you saw, heard, or noticed about the pearl yesterday. Be precise about the sequence of events, and do not omit anything, however small it may seem." One by one the household members spoke. Clara recounted her duties, her memory, slightly disjointed, yet honest. Lady Rosamund described her movements and observations, careful to maintain composure. Aldridge's description was meticulous, almost overly so, as if rehearsed. Harrow spoke with quiet restraint, revealing only fragments of what he had observed. Lady Beatrice recounted her recollections with a certain elegance, her statements polished, each word measured. As each finished, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and considered the nuances, the pauses, the shifts in tone, the fleeting glances. Then she decided to employ her unconventional tactic. She removed the silk cloth and held the pearl in her hand. "This object," she said softly, "has caused no small amount of consternation, yet I am confident it has only been moved with purpose. I would like to try a small exercise in observation. I shall place this pearl at various points around the room, and I ask each of you, without touching it, to tell me what, if anything, seems unusual in its placement or surroundings." The instructions were unusual, even peculiar, and the household hesitated. Miss Marple's tone, however, was calm and non-judgmental, inviting participation without coercion. She began moving the pearl to different spots, on the mantel, on the edge of the desk, near the window-sill, observing closely each person's reaction. At first, there was mild curiosity, polite attention, but no overt response. Clara shifted slightly. Lady Rosamund frowned faintly at the light's reflection. Aldridge maintained a neutral expression. Harrow's eyes, however, lingered longer than seemed natural, and Lady Beatrice's gaze followed the pearl with a subtle tension. Then Miss Marple placed the pearl on the small side table, so that it rested partially on a lace doily, tilted just enough to catch the candlelight. The change was minor, almost imperceptible, but Harrow's reaction was immediate. His hand twitched slightly, and his eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He inhaled sharply, and for a moment his composure cracked. Miss Marple's gaze met his quietly. "You noticed something, Mr. Harrow," she observed gently. "A detail that drew your attention more than it might have drawn another's?" Harrow hesitated, swallowing hard. I merely noticed the pearl's position, Miss Marple. It seemed unusual. I did not expect it to be moved so casually." Miss Marple inclined her head, letting the silence stretch for a moment. Then softly she continued, "The position of objects, their alignment, even the slightest disturbance, can reveal much about human intention, and sometimes a careful observer notices more than is safe to admit." Harrow's eyes flickered toward Lady Beatrice, then downward, and he muttered, almost under his breath, "It was never meant to be. Noticed like that." Miss Marple's mind caught the phrase instantly. The subtle crack in his composure, the hesitation, and the half-spoken words suggested guilt or awareness beyond mere observation. Not overt guilt, perhaps, but knowledge of deliberate movement, of orchestration, of a carefully planned action meant to manipulate others' perceptions. Turning to the rest of the household, Miss Marple said, "Notice how small changes can elicit responses, sometimes revealing truths hidden beneath layers of careful behaviour. People often react to subtleties they cannot control, the tilt of a jewel, the displacement of a leaf, the reflection of light. Even the most cautious may betray themselves when prompted to focus attention in unexpected ways." Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed slightly, and Miss Marple noted a shift in her posture, though it was less pronounced than Harrow's. She made a mental note that the cousin's calm exterior might conceal both awareness and involvement, yet Harrow's reaction was sharper, more immediate. The psychological test had succeeded in revealing something the ordinary methods had not. The observant gardener's careful composure had slipped, however briefly. Miss Marple returned the pearl to its rightful place on the mahogany table. "The exercise is complete," she said gently. "Yet what we have learned is invaluable. It is not always the visible act that betrays the orchestrator of events, but the involuntary response to unusual circumstances. Even those who believe they are careful and discreet can reveal more than they intend when faced with a situation designed to observe, rather than accuse." Harrow's lips pressed into a thin line, and he avoided direct eye contact with Miss Marple, his earlier composure replaced by a subtle tension. Aldridge, too, seemed slightly unsettled, though his expression remained controlled. Clara, relieved, relaxed visibly, sensing that the true threat was elsewhere. Lady Beatrice's measured calm remained, yet Miss Marple noted the faintest sign of unease. Her practiced control could not completely hide the flicker of concern. By the end of the evening, Miss Marple had gathered far more than she had anticipated. The psychological exercise had highlighted hidden knowledge, subtle reactions, and human tendencies to reveal truths under indirect pressure. The clues were not in the evidence itself, nor in the statements carefully prepared for authorities, but in the imperceptible cracks in behaviour, the twitches, the sharp inhalations, the almost unconscious utterances that betrayed awareness of manipulation. Miss Marple reflected quietly as the household retired for the night. The pearl, so carefully observed and positioned, had served as a tool not merely of display, but of revelation. The orchestrator, she now understood, had relied on careful planning and misdirection, yet even the most deliberate actor was susceptible to pressure that played upon instinct, attention, and subtle psychological cues. Harrow's brief lapse, faint though it was, illuminated a path forward, an avenue to uncover the truth that had remained hidden despite all previous inquiries. The detective allowed herself a small smile, confident that the unconventional tactic had provided the insight necessary to move closer to resolution. The case was far from concluded, but the shadows of deception had begun to thin. The real orchestrator of the Pearl's mysterious journey was still among them, concealed behind layers of loyalty, fear, and propriety. But for the first time Miss Marple had glimpsed the faintest outline of the hand that moved with deliberate care behind the scenes. The next steps would require patience, cunning, and careful observation, yet the subtle crack revealed in Harrow's reaction had illuminated a path that might finally expose the truth. Miss Marple awoke the next morning with an uneasy sense of anticipation. The psychological exercise from the previous evening had revealed a crack in the otherwise impeccable composure of the household's members, and she felt certain that momentum was on her side. Yet Ashborne Hall, as ever, seemed to breathe with its own secrets, and she knew that progress could easily be undone if the orchestrator remained clever and cautious. The morning began quietly, with the servants carrying out their routines and Lady Rosamund attending to correspondence. Miss Marple was seated in the drawing-room, reviewing her notes and mapping the interconnections between behaviour, history, and subtle gestures. Harrow and Aldridge were present as well, ostensibly for discussion, though their expressions hinted at wariness. Clara flitted about quietly, still uneasy from the previous evening's exercises. It was during this calm that a sudden commotion erupted from the library. Miss Marple rose immediately, moving swiftly toward the source of the disturbance. There she found Aldridge standing rigidly near the bookcases, his hands shaking. The ledger containing household records, meticulously maintained over decades, lay open on the floor. Pages had been torn, entries obliterated by ink blots, and in one section the margins had been violently scraped, leaving a mess of ink and paper shreds. The ledger," Aldridge stammered. I don't know how it happened. I was bringing it here for review, and now—" Miss Marple approached calmly, examining the destruction. It was clear at once that this was no accident. The ledger had been deliberately tampered with. Someone had sought to erase or alter the records, to conceal a connection, or erase evidence that might illuminate the truth of the Pearl's movements. The work was precise yet hurried, indicative of someone who wished to obliterate the past before scrutiny could reveal their complicity. Lady Rosamund entered, her expression a mixture of shock and indignation. "This is outrageous. The ledger contains decades of our family's history. How could anyone—" Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "Lady Rosamund, it seems that someone wished to remove the ledger before it could provide clarity. We must consider who had both access and motive to destroy such evidence." Harrow, who had been quiet until now, moved closer to the detective. "I saw nothing, Miss Marple. The library was empty when I came in to fetch the ledger." His tone was steady, yet his eyes betrayed the faintest hesitation, a flicker that Miss Marple noted carefully. Clara looked around with wide, frightened eyes. I didn't touch it. I was carrying linens and heard a noise, but when I looked, it was too late." Miss Marple assessed the scene, her mind racing to piece together the likely sequence. The ledger, with its long record of household history, contained details of prior incidents involving the pearl and other valuables. The destruction suggested someone feared that these historical connections might reveal their involvement, or at least expose knowledge they wished to conceal. The orchestrator was no longer content to manipulate perception subtly. They were now actively interfering with evidence. Lady Beatrice, who had been observing quietly, tilted her head slightly. "How unfortunate," she remarked lightly, though her tone carried an underlying edge. "Such records are easily misplaced, or, worse, damaged by careless handling. But surely this does not alter the present, does it?" Miss Marple's eyes, however, lingered on the cousin. Lady Beatrice's composure, always near perfect, was accompanied by a faint tension, a subtle tightening of the lips. It was a small reaction, but one Miss Marple did not overlook. The destruction of the ledger could not have been an accident, and any member of the household with knowledge of its significance and a desire to manipulate the investigation was now a person of interest. Miss Marple gathered the household in the drawing-room, speaking in calm, measured tones. "It appears someone has attempted to remove crucial evidence from our examination. This action, deliberate and timely, suggests a fear of discovery. We must now consider not only opportunity and motive, but also who would benefit most from preventing us from understanding the ledger's contents." The detective's attention returned to Harrow. His brief hesitation earlier, coupled with proximity to the library and knowledge of the household's historical intricacies, made him a likely candidate for involvement. Yet Miss Marple hesitated to make assumptions. The orchestrator might have acted alone, or perhaps encouraged others to carry out the destruction, further obscuring the chain of responsibility. Clara, sensing the tension, spoke softly. "Miss Marple? Yesterday I saw Lady Beatrice near the library just before supper. I thought she was simply looking for a book, but—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the implied observation carefully. Lady Beatrice's presence near the library at a critical moment was suspicious, yet not definitive. Miss Marple's mind turned to the concept of pressure. How the stress of a looming revelation might push even the most composed individual to act impulsively. She considered her previous psychological test with the pearl, and realized a similar approach might now be useful to reveal who had tampered with the ledger. The destruction was an attempt to control perception, to shape the investigation in favor of someone whose motives were still hidden. A strategy began to form. Miss Marple would recreate the circumstances surrounding the ledger's presence in the library. She instructed Aldridge to place the book as it had been that morning, while the household observed. "I would like each of you to tell me if anything seems out of place," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your observations will help us understand what could have prompted the recent disturbance." As the ledger was replaced, subtle reactions emerged. Clara flinched at the sight of the torn pages, while Lady Rosamund frowned with indignation. Aldridge adjusted his stance, hands twitching slightly. Harrow's composure wavered again. He shifted in place, eyes flicking to a corner of the room as if recalling an unseen movement. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed, and for the first time her carefully maintained calm faltered, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. Miss Marple observed each subtle cue. The orchestrator of the ledger's destruction had been forced by this simple act of recreation to confront the consequences of their actions. Their carefully controlled deception was now reacting to environmental stimuli, revealing cracks that were otherwise invisible. "The destruction of evidence," Miss Marple said quietly, "is rarely done without purpose. Whoever acted did so to protect themselves or another, anticipating discovery if the ledger remained intact. By observing your reactions, even small ones, we learn who is most affected by the ledger's presence." Harrow's eyes met hers briefly, then darted away. A faint tremor in his hands, almost imperceptible, betrayed more than words could. Miss Marple made a mental note. The ledger had been destroyed to hide knowledge that Harrow had either acted upon or sought to conceal. Lady Beatrice's reaction, though subtler, suggested complicity, awareness, or at least concern about exposure. The stakes had now risen. The orchestrator was no longer content to manipulate perception from a distance. They were actively intervening, shaping evidence, and attempting to bury truth before it could be revealed. Trust within the household had grown fragile, each member acutely aware that the investigation could expose secrets long hidden. As night descended over Ashborne Hall, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. The vanishing evidence had transformed the investigation, shifting the balance of power towards someone determined to control the narrative. Yet the subtle cues, the reactions, and the historical connections she had already uncovered provided her with a roadmap. The ledger's destruction was a challenge, a warning that the orchestrator was clever, cautious, and patient, but it also confirmed that they feared discovery. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The orchestrator might act to conceal the past, tamper with the present, and manipulate perception, but human nature left traces that could not be entirely erased. She would follow those traces, however faint, until the truth of the Pearl's journey, and the hand that the next morning dawned grey and oppressive over Ashborne Hall, a damp mist curling along the gardens as if the estate itself anticipated the day's events. Miss Marple, as always, rose early, reviewing her notes and tracing the threads of history and human behaviour that had so far guided her investigation. The destruction of the ledger had unsettled the household, yet she felt a quiet determination. Subtle reactions had illuminated cracks in the orchestrator's composure, and she believed the next step lay in careful observation. She was reviewing a map of the house when a sharp, panicked knock echoed through the hall. Lady Rosamund opened the door, pale and trembling. "Miss Marple, something dreadful has happened in the East Wing." Miss Marple followed quickly, sensing the familiar stirrings of urgency that accompanied a true crisis. The East Wing had long been mostly unused, a series of guest rooms and storage spaces, yet the atmosphere now seemed charged with fear. As she entered, she found Clara crouched near the doorway of the farthest room, wringing her hands and whispering something incomprehensible. "What is it, child?" Miss Marple asked gently, kneeling to meet her eyes. "It's Mr. Aldridge, Miss Marple. I found him. He's dead." The detective's heart sank, though she concealed her reaction behind a calm mask. Aldridge, the cook, had been a source of both information and distraction, and his death signalled that the orchestrator was escalating. This was no longer a case of subtle misdirection or tampering with evidence. Someone had resorted to violence to maintain control of the investigation. The scene was grim. Aldridge lay sprawled across the patterned rug of what had once been the billiard room, his expression frozen in surprise. The room showed signs of a struggle. A chair lay overturned, the window slightly ajar, and a faint smear of blood on the polished floor indicated a blow had been delivered swiftly and efficiently. There were no signs of forced entry from the outside. The perpetrator must have been someone with access to the East Wing, or someone who had moved silently through the house. Miss Marple took in the scene carefully. The open window caught her attention, not as a means of escape, but as a potential diversion. The perpetrator had created a path that suggested opportunity, yet she suspected it was misdirection, a deliberate ploy to confuse observers. The orchestration was precise. Evidence of violence, a staged entry point, all intended to unsettle the household and perhaps intimidate the detective. Lady Rosamund, standing just behind her, shook visibly. Who could do such a thing? Aldridge was loyal, dedicated to this house for decades. Miss Marple's gaze swept across the room, noting every detail. A small fragment of cloth clung to the corner of the rug, slightly different in texture and colour from any of Aldridge's garments. A faint residue, oily and pungent, lingered near the windowsill, likely from someone who had handled a lamp or a tool in the darkness. And there, on the table, a small, deliberate scratch marked the polished surface, as though the assailant had brushed against it in haste. She looked toward Harrow, who had entered quietly, his posture rigid and controlled. "You were near this wing this morning, I believe?" Miss Marple asked calmly. Harrow nodded. "I was tending the east garden as usual. He paused, his eyes flicking toward Lady Beatrice. I did not enter this wing." Miss Marple observed the hesitation, subtle though it was. The lie was measured, careful, yet the inflection suggested not innocence, but awareness. He knew more than he admitted, or perhaps feared implication should the wrong conclusion be drawn. Lady Beatrice, for her part, remained composed, though her hands clenched briefly at her sides. The detective noted the pattern. Those with prior knowledge or involvement in the household's secrets reacted differently under stress. Aldridge's murder had introduced a new layer of danger, and the orchestrator was clearly several steps ahead, controlling the pace and the stakes. Miss Marple gathered the household in the drawing-room once more, her expression calm but firm. "We now face a situation more urgent than the previous incidents," she said quietly. "A member of the household has been attacked, and it is clear that someone is attempting to control perception through fear and action. The orchestrator remains within these walls, and their knowledge of our movements and expectations allows them to remain one step ahead." Clara's voice trembled. "Miss Marple, if they killed Aldridge, who's to say they won't strike again? Could they come for any of us?" "Yes, child," the detective replied gently, "and that is why observation, discretion, and careful reasoning are more important than ever. We must not act rashly nor be deceived by the fear the perpetrator wishes to inspire. Each movement, each hesitation, each glance is a clue, if one knows how to observe it." Miss Marple reflected on the psychological tactic from the previous evening. It had revealed cracks in composure, but now, with violence introduced, the game had escalated. She needed to find a method to both protect the household and draw the orchestrator into revealing themselves. She considered the layout of the house, the proximity of rooms, the patterns of access, and the historical behaviors of the suspects. The key, she realized, lay in forcing the perpetrator to act again, predictably, without knowing they were being observed. She turned her attention to the cloth fragment on the rug. Its unusual texture suggested it belonged not to Aldridge, but to someone else, perhaps even the orchestrator. It was a tangible clue, yet insufficient alone. Paired with her observations of Harrow and Lady Beatrice, she began to sense a subtle alignment. The orchestrator was someone who knew the house intimately, who understood human behavior, and who could manipulate the household's reactions to both conceal and reveal simultaneously. Miss Marple devised a plan. She instructed the remaining household members to maintain their normal routines, while she would quietly observe, noting every movement, glance, and interaction. She intended to create a situation in which the orchestrator might attempt another move, another act of misdirection or violence, thus providing an opportunity to catch them in the act. Even as she implemented this plan, the tension in Ashborne Hall thickened. The death of Aldridge had proven that the perpetrator's resolve was absolute, that subtlety alone would no longer suffice. The orchestrator was not merely attempting to conceal a crime. They were willing to escalate, to strike decisively to protect their secret. Miss Marple knew that the next hours would be crucial. An act of observation now could prevent further harm, or at least expose the hand that had so far manipulated events with chilling precision. The detective settled in a corner of the drawing-room, the pearl displayed unobtrusively on the table nearby. Her eyes, sharp and patient, watched for the slightest irregularity, the twitch of a hand, the glance that lingered too long, the posture that betrayed tension. Each small cue could reveal the orchestrator's next move. She had learned long ago that those who sought to conceal truth often overestimated their control, failing to account for the subtle, involuntary betrayals of human behavior. As the day wore on, a hush settled over the estate. The servants moved with careful precision. Lady Rosamund paced slowly, and Harrow and Lady Beatrice appeared to engage in polite conversation, though both were clearly aware of the stakes. Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill. The orchestrator's next act would be a misstep or a calculated reveal, and when it came, it would provide the insight necessary to bring the mystery to light. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the unseen hand to strike again. Miss Marple, patient and attentive, knew that when it did, she would be ready, not merely to observe, but to prevent further tragedy, and finally illuminate the truth behind the pearl, the ledger, and the carefully concealed motives that had driven the household to the brink of fear and suspicion. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing-room, as evening settled over Ashborne Hall, the fading light casting long, ghostly shadows across the polished floors. The events of the past 2 days, the destruction of the ledger, Aldridge's murder, the subtle revelations from her psychological exercises, had created a sense of urgent chaos, yet in that turbulence Miss Marple's mind worked tirelessly, sifting through fragments of observation, whispers of conversation, and subtle behaviours that had once seemed insignificant. She reviewed the details methodically. Harrow had displayed brief but revealing reactions during the Pearl exercise. Clara had observed movements and timing that suggested familiarity with the household's hidden corners. Lady Beatrice's composure had subtly faltered at critical moments, and the ledger had been destroyed to conceal knowledge reaching back decades. The pattern was tangled, layered with history, envy, loyalty, and fear, but Miss Marple sensed that the threads could be drawn together if only she considered the smallest, most overlooked details. Her eyes fell on the pearl itself, resting innocuously on the table. So much of the household's turmoil had centred upon it, yet the pearl was not merely an object of desire. It had become a mirror, reflecting human tendencies and inherited behaviours. But there was one detail she had not yet fully accounted for, a tiny flaw in the pearl's surface, scarcely noticeable, a slight indentation along its otherwise perfect curve. It was something she had observed during the initial psychological exercise, but had dismissed as a mere imperfection of the jewel. Yet now, in the context of the escalating events, it struck her with new significance. Miss Marple recalled Clara's timid remarks from the previous days, the way she had noticed Lady Beatrice near the library, the quiet hesitations about who had been where and when, and the seemingly inconsequential statements about what was observed and what was missed. Each comment had seemed minor, yet now she understood that the household's behaviours had followed a pattern rooted in perception and expectation. The orchestrator had relied upon assumptions of how others would react, creating misdirection while leaving subtle markers that only an attentive observer might notice. She rose and walked to the east wing, retracing the path Aldridge had taken before his death. The overturned chair, the open window, the faint smear of blood, all had seemed chaotic, but Miss Marple now saw intention in the arrangement. The fragment of cloth, the small scratch on the table, and the placement of objects in the room suggested that the orchestrator had moved deliberately to create a narrative, one of a sudden, chaotic intrusion designed to confuse, intimidate, and mislead the household. And yet the flaw in the pearl, the tiny indentation, now connected several seemingly unrelated observations. Miss Marple thought back to her conversation with Harrow during the psychological exercise. He had reacted most sharply when the pearl was placed in a slightly tilted position on the side table, catching the candlelight against its imperfection. His reaction had been brief, almost imperceptible, but it had revealed awareness, even concern. The flaw had been a focal point, triggering a subconscious recognition of prior manipulations of the pearl's placement. Miss Marple's attention turned to Lady Beatrice. During the earlier discussions, her composure had been nearly perfect, yet a subtle tension had accompanied her remarks about the ledger and the pearl. Miss Marple realized that the cousin had likely been aware not only of the pearl's historical significance, but of the orchestrator's methods, perhaps even of the specific flaw in the pearl that had guided previous misdeeds. Lady Beatrice's careful observation and strategic positioning within the household suggested a level of awareness that was almost conspiratorial. The detective moved back to the drawing room, where the remaining household members were quietly gathered, tense from the previous day's events. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Harrow once more. There was a rhythm to his movements, a careful attention to the positions of objects that now seemed less like habit and more like calculated practice. He had been moving the pearl, observing reactions, and manipulating perception with subtlety. Each small adjustment, each glance, each half-acknowledged movement had formed part of a repeating pattern, a deliberate choreography that had gone unnoticed because the cues were so slight. It was then that Miss Marple remembered an earlier comment made by Clara, almost in passing, about the scent of oil in the east wing and a shadow by the window. At the time, it had seemed an irrelevant detail, a small observation from a frightened maid. But now, with the framework of the orchestrator's movements and the repeated focus on the pearl's imperfection, it made sense. The perpetrator had relied upon shadows, light, and physical markers to manipulate the household's perceptions, and in doing so had revealed themselves indirectly through their own predictable behaviour. Miss Marple addressed the household calmly, her voice measured but carrying the weight of quiet authority. "We have been misled, not by chaos but by expectation. The orchestrator has acted with deliberation, relying upon the assumption that each of us would focus on certain details while ignoring others. Yet in doing so, they have left markers, subtle, almost invisible, to those with the patience and observation to notice." Her gaze fell upon Harrow. "Mr. Harrow, you have been careful, but even the most meticulous actions reveal themselves through repetition and attention to detail. The pattern of your movements, your reactions to the pearl, and your awareness of the East Wing all indicate knowledge and control over the recent events." Harrow's posture stiffened, but he did not respond verbally. Miss Marple's observation was precise yet gentle, allowing him the opportunity to speak without direct accusation. The silence was telling. The orchestrator often responded to patience and quiet reasoning more than confrontation. Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered briefly toward Harrow, a hint of understanding passing between them, though her expression remained composed. Miss Marple noted that the cousin's careful exterior had likely masked knowledge, and perhaps complicity, yet the pattern she now discerned suggested that the true driver of events, the one controlling perception, manipulating reactions, and orchestrating the sequence of chaos, was singular in intent and consistent in method. Miss Marple allowed the weight of her reasoning to settle over the room before continuing. "Observe that every detail, however small, has meaning. The indentation in the pearl, the placement of objects, the faint traces of cloth and residue, all form part of a sequence designed to reveal and conceal simultaneously. The key to understanding the orchestrator has been in plain sight all along. It was never the overt act of mischief or destruction that mattered most, but the patterns repeated, the attention to perception, and the small markers that indicated intent." A faint shift in Harrow's stance betrayed acknowledgement, while Lady Beatrice's eyes held a flash of unease. Clara and Lady Rosamund, now understanding the significance of subtlety in the investigation, exchanged worried glances. The pattern, Miss Marple realized, was a map, and it led directly to the individual who had manipulated events from the start. Miss Marple sat back, her mind weaving together all the observations, behaviors, and historical connections. The orchestrator had relied upon the household's routines, inherited knowledge, and assumptions to shape the investigation, yet in the repetition of subtle cues, the truth had emerged. What once seemed random, the tilt of the pearl, a fragment of cloth, a fleeting reaction, now coalesced into a clear pattern. The mystery had never been hidden in complexity alone, but in plain sight, accessible to the careful, patient observer, willing to see beyond superficial appearances. As night fell, Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of insight. The chaos of recent days, the destruction, the violence, and the subtle deceptions had all been leading to this moment. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the path to resolution became evident. The orchestrator's methods, their reliance on perception and expectation, and their careful manipulation of objects and behaviour would soon be illuminated fully, and Ashborne Hall could finally confront the truth that had been in plain view all along. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, the hallways of Ashborne Hall quiet and almost reverential after the revelations of the previous evening. The pattern she had discerned regarding the pearl, the ledger, and the subtle behaviours of the household had narrowed the field of suspects, and her mind now turned to motive. Understanding the why behind actions she knew was as crucial as observing the how. The violence, the manipulation, the deliberate concealment, all indicated more than mere opportunism. There was a psychology at work, one that demanded careful consideration. She began by reviewing the sequence of events in her mind. The initial theft, or manipulation, of the pearl, the destruction of the ledger, Aldridge's murder, and the subsequent observations that had illuminated patterns of behaviour. Each act had been executed with precision, suggesting forethought and deep emotional investment. The orchestrator had acted not only to conceal their own involvement, but to control perception within the household, to guide suspicion toward others, and to maintain a sense of superiority and power. Yet Miss Marple sensed that beneath this surface lay something more profound, a personal compulsion that drove the orchestrator to extremes. Her thoughts returned to Harrow, whose subtle reactions had consistently betrayed an intimate familiarity with the house's secrets, the pearls' placement, and the psychological exercises she had conducted. The minor flaws he revealed through brief gestures, averted glances, and almost imperceptible hesitations suggested he had a stake that transcended wealth or inheritance. Yet as she considered Lady Beatrice's subtle unease, she recognized that there were layers here, connections to history and family, long-standing grievances and rivalries that had been buried under decades of propriety. Miss Marple convened the household once more in the drawing-room. The atmosphere was tense, each member aware that the investigation had reached a decisive stage. She addressed them gently, but with unyielding clarity. We have now observed the movements, the reactions, and the patterns that have guided recent events. What remains is to understand why these actions were taken. For while opportunity and ability explain the how, they do not fully account for the why. Motivation is often the deepest key to understanding human behaviour. Harrow shifted uneasily in his seat, eyes flicking briefly to Lady Beatrice, whose posture remained impeccable, yet her hands clenched tightly. Clara remained silent, watching from the corner, while Lady Rosamund's expression betrayed a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple continued, "The crime has not been about money, nor merely power, nor simple revenge. There is a deeper thread, a personal, almost obsessive drive that has guided these events. To understand it, we must consider not only the past and present actions, but the emotional stakes that have remained hidden until now." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. The pearl itself, though valuable, has always been more than a jewel. It is a symbol, a repository of family history and pride. Its movements and placement have carried meanings beyond mere ownership. The orchestrator sought not only to possess it, but to assert control over the perception of that possession, to manipulate others into a state of dependence or fear, and ultimately to recreate a sense of authority and dominance tied to the legacy of Ashborne Hall. Harrow's hands tightened in his lap. His composure was still present, but it was strained, and a faint flush coloured his cheeks. Miss Marple's eyes, unerring, tracked every subtle twitch, every micro-expression. She continued, "And yet, this motive alone is insufficient. The violence, the tampering, the psychological manipulations all indicate a personal obsession, a compulsion to dominate not merely through circumstance, but through influence over others' perception and actions. This is not greed, nor envy, nor fear alone. It is the drive to assert an identity and control history itself." Lady Beatrice's eyes widened fractionally, betraying the flicker of recognition that Miss Marple had anticipated. "You mean it was personal?" she murmured. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze unwavering. "The orchestrator's actions are guided by an intricate combination of pride, legacy, and the need to assert their understanding and control of the family narrative. Aldridge's murder, the destruction of the ledger, the manipulation of the pearl's placement, all were actions designed to maintain the orchestration of perception, to protect not just secrets, but a personal identity built on knowledge, observation, and dominance." Harrow's voice, almost inaudible, finally broke the silence. I did what had to be done. The pearl, the ledger, they were more than objects. They were proof. Proof of what I had always known, what I had always been responsible for. I couldn't let it fall into careless hands, Miss Marple. I couldn't. Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "And yet, in protecting this knowledge, you allowed fear and violence to guide your hand. The true danger of obsession is not only what one seeks to protect, but the extent to which one will go to assert it. The orchestrator is always several steps ahead, anticipating the reactions of others, yet in doing so, they reveal themselves through the very patterns of their own actions." Harrow lowered his gaze, the strain of the last few days evident in the subtle slump of his shoulders. Lady Beatrice exhaled softly, her composed exterior finally showing relief that the motivation behind the actions had been understood. The psychological pressure, the web of deceptions, and the sequence of events all pointed to a mind driven by a singular personal need, a need to protect a legacy, to assert control, and to maintain identity through knowledge and manipulation. Miss Marple addressed the room in measured tones, bringing the household to a full understanding. Understanding the motive is not an act of accusation, but of illumination. It explains the why behind the how, the psychology that drove the orchestrator to extremes, and the pattern that has now been discerned. Recognition of motive allows us to anticipate behavior, prevent further harm, and ultimately bring resolution. Clara, now breathing more freely, asked, Then the danger is over. Can we finally be safe? Miss Marple's gaze softened, yet remained focused. The danger posed by the orchestrator's compulsion is mitigated once understanding is achieved. The true motive is now known, and in understanding we gain the ability to navigate the actions that might have seemed unpredictable. Knowledge of intent grants us power to prevent repetition, to protect the innocent, and to restore equilibrium. Harrow remained silent, lost in thought, while Lady Rosamund absorbed the weight of the revelations. The pearl, the ledger, the subtle manipulations, all were now understood not merely as acts of mischief or greed, but as expressions of a profound, obsessive psychology. The orchestrator's willingness to go to extremes, even to violence, stemmed from an intrinsic need to control perception, legacy, and identity, a motive far more complex and human than any simple desire for wealth or revenge. Miss Marple finally allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. The web of events, the patterns, and the subtle cues had converged, revealing the hidden psychology that had guided Ashborne Hall into chaos. With the motive now illuminated, the path to resolution and to the careful restoration of peace was clear. The orchestrator's actions, once mysterious and terrifying, could now be understood, confronted, and ultimately addressed, bringing clarity to a household that had teetered on the edge of fear, suspicion, and turmoil for far too long. The evening air in Ashborne Hall was thick with anticipation, the fading sunlight casting long, sombre shadows through the grand windows. Miss Marple had spent the day in quiet preparation, setting the stage for the final act of her investigation. Every observation, every subtle reaction, every hidden detail had been catalogued and understood, and now the time had come to confront the orchestrator directly. She had arranged a seemingly casual gathering in the drawing-room, but every element of the setting, the placement of the furniture, the positions of the household members, even the angle of the lights, was carefully calculated to provoke reaction and reveal truth. Lady Rosamund moved about the room, arranging tea with a nervous energy that betrayed the tension everyone felt. Clara hovered nearby, eyes wide and attentive. Harrow and Lady Beatrice sat across from each other, maintaining an outward composure, yet their subtle movements, crossed legs, fidgeting hands, fleeting glances, betrayed the nervous undercurrent that Miss Marple had anticipated. The detective herself, seated quietly near the pearl displayed upon its velvet cushion, appeared calm, almost serene. Yet behind her, composed demeanour, her mind raced through the orchestration she had devised. The pattern of behaviour, the psychological motives, and the historical knowledge of the household had all led to this moment. The trap was subtle, an opportunity for the orchestrator to reveal themselves through the very traits that had guided their previous actions: pride, attention to detail, and the need to control perception. Miss Marple began the conversation gently, speaking to the entire group with a warm, unassuming tone. It seems we have reached a point where understanding must give way to clarity. Recent events, the tampering of the ledger, the attack on Aldridge, and the careful manipulation of the pearl have all pointed toward an individual guided by a precise, albeit troubling motive. Yet understanding is only part of the solution. We must now confront what has driven these actions and see them laid bare before us. A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the room. Harrow's eyes flickered toward the pearl, lingering slightly longer than necessary, and Lady Beatrice's hand tightened around her teacup. Miss Marple noted these reactions with meticulous attention. "I have reviewed everything carefully," she continued, her gaze sweeping slowly over each person. "The ledger, the subtle cues, the patterns repeated during the psychological exercise, all indicate a single orchestrator, someone who acted not only to protect knowledge, but to assert control over perception, to shape the household's understanding according to their own design." Harrow swallowed visibly, and Lady Beatrice's eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition, or perhaps guilt. Miss Marple allowed a pause, letting the tension settle like a tangible presence in the room. The orchestrator, if careful, might attempt to maintain composure, but even the most disciplined person reveals themselves when confronted with the inescapable truth. "And yet," Miss Marple added softly, "the desire to control, to manipulate, and to dominate perception is a dangerous compulsion. It can lead even the most clever among us to take actions they might not have imagined. The destruction of evidence, the use of fear, and, tragically, the harm of others." She let the words hang in the air, measured and deliberate. Harrow's hand twitched. Lady Beatrice's composure remained, yet a faint sheen of sweat glimmered on her forehead under the lamplight. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but unyielding. "The pearl's flaw, the subtle movements, the residue and marks in the east wing, they have all been observed, and the pattern they form leaves little doubt. Those who sought to manipulate events from behind the scenes have now been seen through their own actions." There was a long, tense silence. Harrow shifted in his seat, attempting to mask the flush rising to his cheeks. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly as she addressed him directly. "Mr. Harrow, the time has come to acknowledge the truth. The actions you took, though perhaps guided by a sense of duty or fear, have endangered lives and disrupted the household. You may speak now, freely, and explain yourself before further consequences are forced by circumstance rather than understanding." Harrow's eyes darted briefly to Lady Beatrice, then back to Miss Marple. A flush of desperation spread across his features. I did what I thought necessary," he stammered. "The ledger, the pearl, it held knowledge that could have ruined everything. I could not risk it falling into the wrong hands. Aldridge, He faltered, his voice catching as emotion overcame him. Miss Marple nodded calmly. "You acted from fear and compulsion, but the methods chosen, violence, concealment, and manipulation, cannot be justified. Understanding the motive allows us to address the actions with clarity, and it is not too late to make amends through honesty and cooperation." Harrow's shoulders slumped. The tightly wound tension, the careful control, began to unravel. He looked toward Lady Beatrice again, as though seeking validation or forgiveness, and in that glance, the final piece of the psychological puzzle was revealed. The orchestrator's need for control was intertwined with long-standing relationships and perceived loyalties, not merely personal gain. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "It is often the case," she said softly, "that the desire to dominate perception arises not from malice alone, but from fear, pride, and an attachment to legacy. Recognition of this truth allows us to prevent further harm, to restore balance, and to bring understanding to the events that have caused so much turmoil." Harrow exhaled shakily. "Yes, I understand now. I see how far I went, how much I allowed fear and compulsion to guide my hands. I will answer all questions and do whatever is necessary to set things right." Lady Beatrice, still maintaining her composure, finally exhaled a quiet sigh, the tension leaving her shoulders. "It appears we have reached the heart of the matter," she said, her voice measured. "The orchestrator has been revealed, and the motivations, though complex, are now understood." Miss Marple allowed the room to absorb the resolution. The orchestrator, having revealed themselves, could now be confronted directly by the authorities, guided to acknowledge not only the actions, but the psychological roots of their behavior. The carefully orchestrated sequence of events, manipulations, minor deceptions, and violent acts had led to this moment, and every detail observed over the past days had culminated in clarity. The detective rose from her chair, her movements unhurried, her presence commanding without force. With the pattern now fully revealed and the motive understood, we can proceed to ensure safety, truth, and accountability. The pearl may be restored to its rightful place, the ledger examined in full, and the household guided back to equilibrium. Knowledge of the orchestrator's actions and the psychology behind them allows us not merely to punish, but to understand, and through understanding, prevent further tragedy. Harrow lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, while Lady Beatrice's eyes softened with a mixture of relief and acknowledgement. Clara and Lady Rosamund, witnessing the careful unravelling of truth, exhaled in quiet relief. The tension that had gripped Ashborne Hall for days finally began to dissipate, replaced with a cautious calm and the sense that order and understanding had been restored. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief, faint smile. The trap had worked not through aggression or accusation, but through patience, observation, and the quiet manipulation of circumstance to reveal truth. The orchestrator, exposed and confronted, could no longer operate in the shadows, and Ashborne Hall, though marked by recent turmoil, was now on the path to resolution and restored balance. As the household slowly settled, Miss Marple glanced at the pearl, its flaw now a symbol not of imperfection but of revelation, the small overlooked detail that had guided her to uncover the orchestrator, their motives, and the pattern of events. The case was complete, the mystery unravelled, and the final confrontation had affirmed the power of observation, patience, and understanding in the face of human complexity. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Ashborne Hall, glinting off the polished surfaces and illuminating a household that had begun to settle, cautiously, into a semblance of normalcy. Harrow, subdued and reflective, had confessed his manipulations and provided the authorities with every detail he could recall. Lady Beatrice and the rest of the family were attempting to return to routine, though a faint tension still lingered in the air, the invisible residue of fear and uncertainty. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the hearth with a cup of tea, allowed the household to breathe, though her mind was never at rest. She had learned long ago that in human affairs, especially those tangled with obsession and subtle deception, resolution was rarely absolute. The morning passed with an almost deceptive calm. Miss Marple had arranged a brief review with the household, ensuring that the ledger was examined and the pearl carefully documented and secured. The authorities had taken statements, catalogued evidence, and begun the process of formal closure. Everything appeared to fall neatly into place, the story of Harrow's compulsion and his manipulation of perception seemingly complete. And yet, as Miss Marple reviewed her notes, a small unease began to prick at the edge of her mind. Something was missing, something subtle yet insistent, like a faint echo of a note played slightly off-key in a symphony otherwise harmonious. It was Clara who drew attention to the anomaly. She approached Miss Marple hesitantly, a folded scrap of paper, clutched in her hand. "Miss Marple, I found this behind the portrait in the gallery," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective took the paper and smoothed it carefully, her eyes narrowing as she read the delicate, looping handwriting. It was a note, unsigned, containing a brief, cryptic message. "Not all pieces have been moved, and not all eyes have seen." Miss Marple felt the familiar spark of curiosity ignite. The message was subtle, almost playful, yet it carried an unmistakable weight of intention. It suggested that, despite Harrow's confession and the apparent closure, there were threads in the tapestry of events that remained unseen, and someone else, someone who had remained in the shadows, might still be orchestrating from behind the scenes. She rose immediately, motioning for Clara to stay close. "Thank you, child," she said quietly. "This is far more significant than it appears at first glance. There is still a layer to uncover, and it may change everything we thought we knew." Miss Marple began a meticulous re-examination of the household's layout, movements and interactions over the previous days. She recalled subtle inconsistencies, the timing of Lady Beatrice's excursions to the East Wing, the brief absence of certain staff during critical moments, and the fleeting expressions that seemed too carefully managed to be mere politeness. She noted, too, the cryptic tone of the message, playful yet deliberate, a hallmark of someone confident in their ability to remain unseen while manipulating events. Her attention was drawn once again to the pearl. Though secured, it had been handled extensively in recent days, and each interaction left minute traces of human presence. The floor, previously identified as a key element in Harrow's pattern, now seemed to serve another purpose, as a marker perhaps for the true orchestrator to track how others responded to it, or even as a subtle signal to any accomplice. Miss Marple moved through the hallways, retracing the path Aldridge had taken on the day of his death, noting the angles of light, the shadows cast by furniture, and the points at which minor interactions had occurred. She realized that the final piece of the puzzle had been present all along, hidden in plain sight, masked by the drama surrounding Harrow's manipulations. The orchestrator had counted on the chaos created by Harrow to obscure their own involvement, and so far the household had overlooked it entirely. Her suspicions began to coalesce into a startling theory. The handwriting on the note, the cryptic phrasing, the subtle cues left behind, all suggested a mind that understood not only the household's routines, but the psychological tendencies of the people within it. The orchestrator, Miss Marple realized, was not merely reacting to Harrow's compulsions, but had been guiding events subtly from the very beginning, ensuring that Harrow would take the blame while the real manipulator remained unseen. Miss Marple convened the household once more, this time with a deliberate sense of calm urgency. "It appears," she began, "that our understanding of recent events may have been incomplete. While we believed Harrow to be the sole orchestrator, evidence suggests that another mind has been at work, guiding the sequence of events and exploiting the chaos for purposes we have yet to fully understand." Lady Beatrice's expression hardened slightly, though her composure remained intact. "Another mind? Who could that possibly be?" she asked, her voice measured but tinged with unease. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, noting each reaction with precision. "It is someone familiar with the house, intimately aware of its occupants and routines, and capable of subtle manipulation. They have remained in the shadows, allowing Harrow to execute the visible sequence of events, while they observed, refined, and, if necessary, intervened in ways designed to remain unnoticed." The household shifted uneasily. Harrow's eyes widened, though he said nothing. Clara clutched her hands nervously, and Lady Rosamund's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple continued, her tone calm but insistent. "This orchestrator has left a message for us, one intended to suggest continuity, a reminder that not all pieces have been moved, and not all eyes have seen. It is clever, calculated, and entirely consistent with a mind trained in observation and subtle psychological control." She approached Lady Beatrice slowly, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed tension beneath the surface. "Lady Beatrice, your composure is admirable, yet certain movements and interactions over the past days suggest awareness beyond mere observation. The note, the timing of your appearances, and your subtle reactions all indicate that you may have played a role in guiding, or at least enabling, the orchestration that has taken place." A flicker of colour rose in Lady Beatrice's cheeks, and for a brief moment her mask of composure cracked. "Miss Marple, I did not expect you to notice," she murmured, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "I only sought to protect certain family interests, to ensure that the pearl and ledger remained secure. I never intended—" "You intended," Miss Marple said softly, completing the thought, "to manipulate perception, to guide Harrow's actions, and to ensure that control remained aligned with your understanding of family legacy. The motives are intertwined with legacy, pride, and careful observation, and while your actions may have been guided by a desire to protect, they have nonetheless shaped events in ways that created danger and deception." The revelation rippled through the room. Harrow's earlier confession, while sincere, now appeared as part of a broader scheme, orchestrated and influenced by Lady Beatrice's subtle interventions. The final twist, unexpected yet perfectly consistent with the observations Miss Marple had made, shook the household's understanding of the case. What had seemed resolved was in fact far more complex, and the true depth of the orchestrator's psychology and influence had only just been revealed. Miss Marple allowed the moment to settle before concluding. "The lesson, as ever, is that the human mind is capable of intricate, subtle action, and that even when a case appears resolved, Careful observation and attention to the smallest details can reveal truths previously unseen. The orchestrator has been revealed not through violence alone, but through the marks left in human behaviour, the subtle patterns, and the final, almost playful message that reminded us that vigilance and insight are always necessary. Lady Beatrice sank into a chair, the realization of exposure settling heavily upon her, while Harrow exhaled in quiet resignation. The household, though shaken, now possessed the knowledge of the full scope of manipulation, and Miss Marple's keen insight had once again illuminated the final hidden truth. Even in the calm that followed, the lesson lingered. In human affairs, closure is rarely absolute, and genius often lies in seeing the last twist that everyone else has overlooked. The evening settled over Ashborne Hall with a heavy, almost sombre calm. The air carried the scent of old wood, wax polish, and the faint traces of candle smoke from days past. Yet beneath this quiet lay the tension of revelations still echoing through the house. Miss Marple moved deliberately through the familiar corridors, reflecting on the unfolding of events. The final twist had revealed Lady Beatrice as the true orchestrator, guiding Harrow's compulsions and manipulating perception to maintain control over the household's legacy. And yet, even with this knowledge, the matter of justice remained unresolved, a delicate balance between law, morality, and human frailty. Miss Marple gathered the household in the drawing-room one last time. The pearl rested securely on its cushion, the ledger had been catalogued and carefully stored, and the servants and family alike had begun to grasp the full scope of manipulation and intent. Harrow sat quietly, subdued, while Lady Beatrice remained composed, though the tension in her posture betrayed the weight of exposure. Miss Marple's calm gaze swept across the room, assessing reactions, noting every micro-expression, and considering how the final resolution might unfold. "Over the past weeks," she began, her voice soft but unwavering, "we have witnessed a sequence of events that, at first glance, seemed chaotic and without clear origin. Yet through careful observation, analysis, and understanding of human behaviour, the pattern has emerged. The orchestrator has been revealed, and the motives behind the actions are now understood. But understanding alone does not ensure justice, nor does it erase the consequences of decisions made in secrecy and compulsion." Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered briefly, a subtle acknowledgement of her own role in the chain of events. She maintained her composure, but the faint tightening of her hands on her lap revealed her inner deliberation. Miss Marple continued, "Justice is a nuanced concept, especially when actions are driven by complex motives, fear, pride, legacy, and the desire to control perception. The law can respond to actions, but the deeper truths often require understanding beyond what is immediately visible." Miss Marple walked slowly around the room, letting her presence command attention without demanding it. Harrow's actions, while wrong, were influenced and guided by someone with intimate knowledge of the household and a keen understanding of human behaviour. It is this guidance, subtle yet powerful, that led to the most serious consequences, including the tragic death of Aldridge and the tampering with evidence. The final responsibility, therefore, rests with the orchestrator, the one who shaped events from the shadows and allowed them to unfold according to a carefully designed pattern. Lady Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin line, yet she did not interrupt. Miss Marple continued. The hidden clues were always present. The slight hesitation in Harrow's movements, the way he reacted to the pearl's imperfection, the timing of excursions to the east wing, and the cryptic note discovered behind the portrait, all were subtle indicators of guidance and manipulation. To the casual observer, these details may have seemed inconsequential, but they revealed the invisible hand-shaping events. It was this pattern that allowed the true orchestrator's actions to be discerned. A hush settled over the room. Clara shifted uneasily, while Harrow lowered his gaze, silent acknowledgement in his posture. Miss Marple's eyes returned to Lady Beatrice. "Your intellect and subtle control ensured that perception followed the path you intended. Yet even the cleverest manipulations cannot remain concealed indefinitely. Human behaviour, patterns, and repeated tendencies leave traces, however faint. Recognition of these traces has brought us here today." Lady Beatrice finally spoke, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of defiance. "And what will you do, Miss Marple?" "I acted to protect the family legacy. I did not intend harm beyond what was necessary." Miss Marple's gaze remained composed. "Intent is crucial to understanding, but it does not erase consequences. The law may weigh your intentions against the outcomes, but the household must also reckon with the reality that trust was manipulated, lives were endangered, and perception was orchestrated to conceal truth. Justice, in its fullest sense, requires acknowledgement, accountability, and an understanding of the human motives that drive actions beyond surface appearances." For a moment, silence dominated the room. Then, without warning, Lady Beatrice's expression shifted, a fleeting look of resignation crossing her features. "I suppose I must answer for my actions, then," she murmured, her voice quiet, almost weary. "If understanding is part of justice, then I cannot hide behind intent any longer." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Acknowledgement is the first step. Yet justice may take many forms. The law will determine the formal consequences, but understanding, insight, and the lessons learned by the household provide another dimension, one that ensures similar manipulations cannot recur unnoticed." Clara exhaled quietly, relief mingled with the residual tension. Harrow too looked up, a faint trace of gratitude in his eyes, though he knew his complicity had left its mark. Miss Marple allowed the weight of the room to settle before speaking again. "Observe, everyone, that the smallest details, the flaw in the pearl, the slight hesitation of a movement, a note hidden in plain sight, are what revealed the truth. These markers, seemingly insignificant, were keys to unlocking the orchestration and understanding the psychological motives behind the events. It is a reminder that observation and insight are as vital to justice as law itself." Lady Rosamund, who had remained silent, finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Then, even if formal justice takes time, we have gained understanding, we know the truth, and that knowledge prevents further harm." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "Exactly. Knowledge and understanding are forms of justice that often precede legal action. The orchestrator may face consequences, yet the household now possesses the awareness to prevent repetition and to recognize patterns that might otherwise remain hidden." For a moment the calm seemed complete. The pearl gleamed softly on its cushion, the ledger rested securely on its shelf, and the household began to breathe more freely. And yet, beneath the surface, Miss Marple felt the subtle reminder that human behaviour is never entirely predictable, and even resolution carries the potential for future surprises. Justice had been served, or at least begun, but the nuances of intent, perception, and psychological manipulation left a lingering sense that vigilance was always required. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window to watch the evening sky deepen into twilight. "The mystery has been unravelled, the pattern revealed, and the orchestrator exposed," she said softly, almost to herself. "Yet the human heart is intricate, and the mind capable of cunning beyond immediate comprehension. We have learned that justice is not always absolute, but understanding provides a safeguard, a light by which even the subtlest deception can be discerned." As Ashborne Hall settled into a tentative calm, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The case, now fully illuminated, had tested her powers of observation, patience, and understanding to their utmost limits. Every hidden clue, every minor inconsistency, and every subtle interaction had contributed to the final revelation. The villain's psychology, motives, and manipulations had been exposed, and the household could now face the future with eyes wide open, armed with knowledge and the awareness that, even when the storm passes, the lessons of perception and human complexity endure. The hall remained silent, the shadows lengthening across polished floors, the pearl glinting softly in its display, and the knowledge of what had truly occurred settling into the consciousness of all present. Justice, whether formal or moral, had been achieved, yet the lingering subtlety of human cunning reminded Miss Marple that vigilance was never unnecessary, and that even in resolution the mind must remain alert to the faintest hints of deception. The first chill of evening crept across the grounds of Ashborne Hall, rustling the old oaks that had watched silently over the estate for generations. Miss Marple walked slowly along the gravel path leading from the house, her figure small against the long shadows cast by the fading sun. The household behind her had begun to settle, slowly absorbing the full scope of revelations, the exposure of Lady Beatrice's orchestration, Harrow's confession, and the intricate web of psychological manipulation that had led to Aldridge's tragic death. Yet, as Miss Marple often reflected, even when the visible threads of a mystery had been untangled, the invisible threads, the subtle, lingering questions, rarely dissipated completely. Her thoughts wandered to the minor details she had noted during the investigation, the elements that had seemed inconsequential at first, but had subtly contributed to her ultimate understanding of the events. The flawed pearl had been one of these, a tiny imperfection that held far more significance than anyone had imagined. The cryptic note hidden behind the portrait had been another, a playful challenge left by Lady Beatrice that suggested her mind had been several steps ahead, even while appearing invisible. And yet, even now there remained an anomaly that refused to settle neatly into the narrative, a small smudge on the ledger, barely perceptible, that seemed neither accidental nor explained by any of the movements she had traced. Miss Marple paused, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes, and allowed herself a moment to ponder. That smudge had been subtle, easily overlooked by all but the most attentive eye, yet it carried an intention, a message perhaps even beyond Lady Beatrice's design. It hinted at the possibility that there were elements of the orchestration that had escaped full observation, details that might point to a still unseen hand influencing events. The thought sent a familiar thrill through her, a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity, the dual engines of every detective's work. As she continued along the path, she considered the household itself. The family, servants and friends had been drawn into a story far larger than they could have imagined, a story of obsession, manipulation, and subtle psychological control. Each person had revealed truths, whether through hesitation, gesture, or unguarded glance, and each truth had been a piece in the puzzle. Yet even as the house returned to its cautious rhythm, she could not shake the sense that the world remained larger and more intricate than the events of these past weeks. Human behaviour, she mused, was infinite in its variety, and even the smallest hint could signal the beginnings of a new mystery. Her eyes caught sight of a small figure moving along the edge of the gardens, a child, perhaps no more than 8 or 9, holding a scrap of paper tightly in their hand. Miss Marple recognised the child as one of the visiting relatives, often overlooked in the bustle of adult interactions, yet quietly observant. The child's presence was unremarkable at first glance, yet she noticed the careful way they paused, looked both directions, and then tucked the paper into a hidden pocket before darting out of sight. It was a small, innocuous movement, but it carried all the hallmarks of attention and discretion, a subtlety that could easily conceal significance. Miss Marple smiled faintly, the corners of her eyes crinkling. She had long known that the smallest observers often noticed the largest truths. She could not yet discern what the paper contained, nor whether it was related to the smudge in the ledger, the flawed pearl, or some other element she had yet to uncover. But her instincts whispered that it was important, another thread in a tapestry that was never truly finished, a hint that even as one chapter closed, another quietly awaited discovery. She continued along the path, the silhouette of the hall growing dim against the deepening twilight. Her mind wandered to the broader implications, the psychology of manipulation, the subtle interplay of pride, fear, and legacy, and the way human intention could ripple across lives in ways both visible and unseen. Each mystery left its echo, a lingering question, a faint whisper of what might yet unfold. Ashborne Hall, with all its grandeur and hidden corridors, would hold stories yet untold, and she knew that her presence there had only illuminated one layer among many. As Miss Marple reached the edge of the estate, where the gravel gave way to the forest path beyond, she paused again. A soft wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fading blooms. She reflected on the resolution achieved, the exposure of Lady Beatrice, the acknowledgement of motive, and the careful restoration of order within the household. Justice, understanding, and the revelation of truth had been attained. Yet she could not ignore the subtle cues that remained unresolved. The smudge, the child's secretive action, and the faint suggestion that someone, or something, had remained hidden even. Within the final confrontation left her mind alert, questioning and ready. A faint, almost imperceptible sound drew her attention, a soft shuffle of paper, a whisper of movement just beyond the line of trees. She did not turn immediately, sensing that the observation itself was more important than reaction. The world of human behavior was infinite, she knew, and the mysteries that persisted in subtle gestures, cryptic notes, and minor anomalies were the ones that often proved most consequential. She smiled again, quietly acknowledging the thrill of the unknown. As the last light faded and the first stars began to glimmer in the evening sky, Miss Marple continued along the path, her steps deliberate, her mind attentive to every detail. Ashborne Hall receded behind her, yet its mysteries, like faint shadows, followed in her thoughts. The case of the cursed pearl had reached resolution, but the lingering questions, the subtle clues, and the human capacity for complexity ensured that no story ever truly ended. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the notion that each resolution was merely a prelude to the next observation, the next insight, the next uncovering of truth. The smudge, the cryptic note, and the child's subtle gesture were threads that might, in time, reveal another layer of human intention and cunning. And in that she found both satisfaction and anticipation, the dual pleasures of a detective's life. The path ahead was quiet, yet charged with potential. She knew that mysteries never truly conclude. They evolve, shift, and reappear, hidden in plain sight until the attentive eye perceives them. Her mind, ever alert to nuance, was ready for whatever awaited. And as she walked into the approaching night, Miss Marple carried with her the certainty that no matter how much was resolved, the world always had one more secret to reveal and one more story to be told.